Welcome to Theology Thursday, an ecumenical space for students to discuss matters of faith and theology.
I'm your host, Connor Grubbs.
I am your co-host, Ryan Mock.
And I'm your co-host, Johnny Grubbs.
Welcome back to another week of Theology Thursday. We want to thank our Patreons for supporting us. If you're interested in getting involved in that, we have a weekly after show as well as a monthly podcast. Now, I want to clarify some things. We were talking about that monthly exclusive podcast for Tier 2 and Tier 3 Patreons being Worship Wednesdays. The idea would be that we go into contemporary worship songs and we kind of analyze the lyrics from a theological perspective. We decided not to do that podcast, and there's a couple of reasons. I was debating, one, this seems like something that should be available to the general public. But two, is this something that all of our Patreons would necessarily be interested in? Just because you like Theology Thursday doesn't mean that you're really into worship music. So this may not be something that really adds value for you as one of our supporters. So another idea that I had a while back and just kind of put on the back burner was that we would do book reviews, right? And that was just going to be for the YouTube channel. But nobody really cares what we have to say about books. However, if you are supporting Theology Thursday and you're into theology and we're reading theology books, then this is like extra content that I think actually adds value for you. So it just seemed like a better fit for our Patreons. So the new monthly exclusive podcast is the Theology Thursday Reading Hour.
Wait, so does this mean that me and Johnny have to read books?
Do you guys not read books?
Darn it.
Thankfully,
No, I do read.
I do hire somebody to read me books.
My mom reads me bedtime stories at night. Does that count?
My 2-year-old reads me books. Does that count? No, I read books. I already have a book that I want to talk about.
I do too, actually.
Yeah,
That's how I got on the show, was talking about a book.
That's actually why, because I know you guys talk about books. And we are always like, oh, let's go through a book together. Let's talk about it. In fact, there's one that might be really interesting to go into just for our Patreons that you've been talking about. Ooh. You've been wanting us to study together.
There'd be some hot takes in there.
Yeah, but
that's what they pay
that's what
for,
they're paying for is the hot takes.
All right, well, we'll talk about it.
Anyway, Tier 1 is the weekly after show. Tier 2 is weekly after show plus monthly Reading Hour podcast. Tier 3 is all of that plus merch. Anytime we drop new merch, it gets sent directly to your door. It's just a way to say thank you for supporting us. So we do appreciate you all. We really do.
Thank you.
Thanks. My subpoint this week is rather boring. I've taken on the subpoint this week, but it's something that I was really excited about.
Is it better than the cube rule?
I guess it depends on who you're asking.
Okay.
I think it's better than the cube rule.
Is it a taco?
If you're confused about the cube roll, listen to last week. But Connor, go ahead.
John Foreman came out with a new album.
I like it. Okay.
You like it? Okay. Okay.
I'm
just okay. Not
It's
great.
It's called Departures, and John Foreman, if you don't know, is the frontrunner of Switchfoot, but he also does some solo projects. Johnny, what do you not like about it?
Well, okay, I've only listened to it a couple of times. Okay, so there's that. I don't know. I think for me, I like a song. I'm trying to figure out how. I'm just talking about musically. I like a song that is pretty definitive, like with the vocals and stuff. And there's this trend of like kind of washing out the vocals and kind of like the music's all kind of like blend. It just seems washed out. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever. It just seems like there's a lot of songs with a lot of after effects.
Like it's a little more atmospheric and
yeah, the atmospheric stuff. And
Yeah.
John Foreman's always done that. But like his last solo project was like 4 smaller albums, which is really what he like that was his first solo project. And there would be like 3 songs that were like folksy and like pretty clear, you know, and then there were the atmospheric stuff. And I feel like maybe 60 to 70% of this album is atmospheric, and I'm more into like the Jesus, I Have My Doubts, and like the other music on that new record that's like it's acoustic, it's him, it's yeah. Sorry. What do you think, Connor?
I like it.
You like it okay? Or
That's
do you
your
like
sub-
it?
No, so I think that's an interesting perspective, though, because I would argue that even Switchfoot's last couple albums have gotten more into that atmospheric kind of ambient sound.
Well, I'm trying to think what their last record was.
They did Voices, and then they did Where the Light Shines Through.
Where the Light Shines Through. Yeah, well, I
Oh, Native Tongue is what the other one was
Native
called. Voices
Tongue.
was one of the songs on it.
But like, I think more than half the songs on those records are not atmospheric.
Fading West really was. That felt like a very
Fading
poppy
West
album.
was pop, you know.
Yeah.
Like, I really don't think. I don't feel like there's a lot of atmospheric stuff on there.
Yeah, but to me, I guess what I'm hearing is like that kind of washed out, like kind of blendy ambient sound is very prevalent in pop music. So you're not necessarily talking about like how pop does that. You're just talking about kind of a different, more of an indie style, I guess.
I suppose.
I don't know. I liked it, and I liked their last album, Native Tongue, a lot. Switchfoot's last album. Both of these, you know, some people like, there's like the debate of, oh, Christian music. There's some great interviews with John Foreman recently where he's talked about that. That like some of these bands should be like Need to Breathe or Switchfoot should be more blatant in their like Christian messages or whatever. And I don't necessarily think that you have to. Not every song has to be a worship song. Like it's their own music. But I don't think Switchfoot has ever been ingenuine, like inauthentic. Like they've always shared in the way John Foreman writes songs. Like it's always coming from a sincere place. And because he is a Christian, sometimes that comes through. Sometimes it's more obvious than others. But anyway, this album in particular deals with doubt and faith and depression and a lot of these things. Like lyrically, I thought it was one of his stronger works.
I agree with that, and I really loved the lyrics of the album, and I loved that he was delving deep, especially after this past year. Like, Jesus, I Have My Doubts is such a great song. It leaves a lot of things open-ended, but still bringing it to Jesus, and like explicitly. I love that, and I think it's so short-sighted what a lot of people have done by, you know, I remember, especially back in the day when fundamentalism was a bigger thing and postmodernism hadn't like quite creeped in the way that it had, you know, people would be like, they're a crossover band, right? They've crossed over into the secular world. And so people were like, well, that's cool. And, or it's not cool. The reality is they have the capacity to reach people that like we, like in mainstream ministry, will never have the capacity to reach. They've been in places and clubs with pretty explicit messages of the hope that comes from the gospel, right? I mean, so I love their ministry. They ministered to me personally, so I love it. So if you're not a fan of Switchfoot, go listen to their records and John Foreman's solo stuff and Departures is pretty good.
Yeah, I went to the Native Tongue concert when their tour came through Tampa, and just the mix of people that you had in that room was very unique.
Oh, yeah.
They've definitely reached a pretty broad audience, and they didn't shy away from, you know, the point of their music. And I think John Foreman's one of the better songwriters of our time. Like, if we're just talking about even from a lyrical standpoint, like his songs have always really resonated with me. Like that's some of my favorite stuff. So
you said John Foreman, and for some reason my mind immediately went
thinking
to
about George Foreman.
George Foreman Grill, which we had as growing up. You have the George Foreman Grill, and you make the burgers, and it has the juices coming out. I never listened to Switchfoot.
What a great story, Ryan. Will you listen to Switchfoot after talking with us?
Maybe. Sure, I'll give it a listen, and then maybe next week I'll give you my thoughts.
Do you listen on Spotify?
Yes.
Can I make you like a playlist of specific Switchfoot songs?
Yeah, like the best of.
Yeah.
Of their records so far. I think that would be a good start, because then, yeah, do that for him.
Yeah,
we're gonna convert him,
and I'll even I'll link it. Maybe I'll link it in next week's episode, so you guys can check out some of their best work as well. Okay. Ooh, I'm thinking of a couple songs by his solo album that you'll really like. Anyway, we should move on to the main topic. So we've talked several times already about Ravi Zacharias. I did not think that we would be talking about this again, but we are. And here's the thing. Ryan, I want you to reiterate something that you've already said a couple times, but I think it's a very important point before we move forward, is a lot of people ask the question, why does it matter? He's dead. why are we bringing all this stuff up when he's not even alive anymore, when he's not even leading the ministry anymore? Could you speak to why that matters?
Yeah, I think there's several reasons why this does matter. And I think the most important reason is for the sake of justice. Like when we read about what Ravi Zacharias engaged in and what he did, he violated people, and those people, while Ravi Zacharias is dead, those people are still alive. And so, by bringing this to light and shedding light on these issues, we are vindicating them. We are setting them free from this by at least talking about it. If we were to just say, "Oh, Ravi Zacharias is dead, let's not talk about it anymore," then what are we saying to those victims? Right. So I think that's one of the biggest reasons is for the sake of justice. We want justice. But also the other reason is that it just reminds us that the Christian celebrity culture is not good overall.
Right. So, I'm doing this a little bit out of order. I want to speak to this as if this is your first time hearing about it. And also just kind of a warning moving forward, if you have young people listening with you or whatever, that we're going to deal with some sensitive topics today. But it's important. So, Ravi Zacharias, famous Christian apologist, passed away. It was last year, right? That he passed away. So, shortly after his death, just a few months, there started to be these allegations of sexual abuse that arose. And just recently, in this past week, all of these things were confirmed and even more came to light. Particularly things like him saying to some of the people that he abused, if you tell anybody about this, you will be responsible for thousands of souls not coming to Christ.
Oh.
So he's using his authority, so to speak, even though he's not even a pastor. He doesn't really have any spiritual authority. He's using his position in his ministry
as a Christian celebrity.
Yeah, there you go. To manipulate people into not speaking up about the abuse. And so, a lot of messages and things were found on his phone and his social media and stuff. So all this stuff has kind of been confirmed, and it's come back. Pretty serious stuff. Now, Ravi Zacharias wrote a lot of books. He did a lot of conferences, and it was always defending the faith. Sort of this intellectual, this Christian intellectual that a lot of people, especially people who like to study apologetics, really put him up on a pedestal. And I'd like to note that just because somebody has a moral failure doesn't mean that everything they said was wrong. Like, there's still plenty of things that he taught that, or things that he, wrote about that have value, but like Zondervan is not going to publish any of his works anymore. Like, they're just going to... Almost all his stuff was published through them, and they released a statement saying that they're not going to do it anymore. And people are like, well, you can't do that. This is part of history. It's like cancel culture. So it's really interesting to kind of see people's reactions of, like... It's difficult because bad people can still speak true things, but there are consequences, for actions. And so some people have come up to speak. There's been on Twitter and a bunch of different things. This has become a big conversation since this came to light last week of how Christian purity culture and like bad teaching on sex and on purity has actually kind of contributed to this problem, because Carl Lentz and some other people like we think of that are Christian celebrities that have fallen morally. Basically, some people have been sharing thoughts about why it's actually like Christian purity culture and teaching that was especially popular in the 90s and early 2000s, it seemed like, is actually really damaging and has led to some of this behavior. It doesn't excuse it, but it's from this framework that a lot of this stuff has been perpetuated. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, is sort of the bad teaching on Christian purity and sexuality. Johnny, I know you have a lot of thoughts about this topic.
Well, I mean, I think for me, it was part of my journey, and I think even as we talk, there's going to be some exploration here of like what is the right way of thinking and viewing this, because on one hand you have the purity culture of like say Billy Graham, who like said, oh, well, I'll never be alone with a woman and always have somebody come with me when I'm on trips to like hotels and stuff like that. And on one hand you wonder, well, could that have actually been a good thing? Maybe in the case of Ravi Zacharias, like to have that level of I'm not even gonna like create like a place for that stuff to occur. The flip side is you have the idea that it's all on the women and their presence and all this kind of stuff, and it becomes a little bit sexist. And it's kind of like, dude, why don't you just be a good, pure, wholesome man? Like just like operate in self-control like Paul asks you to. So there's a lot of questions still I have surrounding this, but I certainly have been on a journey. When I grew up, I read I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and I was like, this is great. This is the gospel. At least in the sense that I felt, like this was the way to avoid a lot of sexual mistakes, because when you're young, when you're a teenager, there's a lot of hormones going on and a lot of that kind of stuff. And it was a great way, I thought at the time, to look at things objectively. The premise of Harris's I Kissed Dating Goodbye is basically, like forget about recreational dating, and there's actually some wisdom in the book, but it contains these segments that were a part of a lot of purity conferences that were popular that you referred to, like True Love Waits and stuff like that. And that is that if you follow these guidelines, don't have sex until marriage, only hold hands, only court people, versus dating people. If you do this, your sex life is going to be great when you get married. You're not going to stumble, because you'll get married and then you'll have great sex and then you won't need it anywhere else, type of thing. In so many words, these things were communicated in these books, in these conferences. And Caitlin Beatty, a popular Christian thought leader, wrote a piece basically calling this, and I love the term, the sexual prosperity gospel, right? That the Christianity preaches, right? We have the prosperity gospel, which says if you follow the gospel, if you put your faith in Jesus, then you'll be healthy, wealthy, and wise. If you follow Jesus in the area of purity according to their standards, maybe not really biblical standards, then you'll have a great sex life and you won't stumble. Well, that doesn't deal with the heart issue, right?
Yeah.
You can have all the Billy Graham things in place, but there was something fundamentally wrong on the heart level.
Right.
I think in terms of Ravi Zacharias, whether it was power, whether I don't know what was going on behind the scenes. Maybe he was on a faith journey. He was trying to convince himself of his faith. I speculate that now. There's a lot of things that go on, and I start to wonder. We know on the surface level, modifying behavior does not result in sanctification, right? Sanctification results in behavior that bears the fruit of the Holy Spirit. So we know this, and yet we bought into, at least around sexuality, because it was practical, because you could get a kid to wear a purity ring and not have sex. We bought into flipping the script and saying, well, modify your behavior and then the fun will follow.
Right. And beyond even like behavior modification before marriage, I think people have been talking a lot about problems with how we teach how it works within a marriage, how sex works.
Right.
And so I'm going to quote, these are books that were kind of written during these time period. I'm just going to directly quote several. These are books on marriage and sexual purity, and you're going to see a very concerning pattern. In fact, going back and reading this, some of them I didn't believe were real, but they are. So one very popular one was Every Man's Battle, or Every Young Man's Battle. They had this series. And in this it says, because of male hardwiring, men don't naturally have that Christian view of sex. We find another reason for the prevalence of sexual sin among men. We got there naturally, simply by being male. So teaching this idea that, well, God designed you that way, to be horny, basically.
And immediately you're giving men an out,
Yes.
There's no responsibility.
And it goes further, because then it starts to place the responsibility on the wife. I can't believe some of these quotes that I'm about to read, but they're real. This comes from Tim LaHaye. That doesn't surprise me. Tim LaHaye's a goofball. Women must cultivate the problem of visual lust, whereas men almost universally must cope with the problem just because they are men. Every Man's Battle says, once he tells you he's going cold turkey, be like a merciful vial of methadone for him. Okay, let me finish. I'm just going to go through and wrangle. I'm just going to wrangle off all the quotes, and then we can deal with this, because there's kind of a... By the way, again, this is not safe for children, this podcast, but I'm reading you quotes from Christian books on these topics that have come out. Kevin Lehman wrote a few books about this, and he says... And in this, he wrote that wives should give husbands oral sex or handjobs during their periods or postpartum phase because these are difficult times for the man.
Oh my goodness, Lord!
So now a husband can't be expected to withstand temptation by himself when she's cramping, bleeding, or birthing a child, because he was just designed that way. And this is what he goes on to say: either you will have a love affair with your husband, or somebody else will.
I have so much to say about that.
I feel bad for this man's wife. Emerson Eggerichs, in a book called Love and Respect, says the cold hard truth is that men are often lured into affairs because they are sexually deprived at home. So now it's the woman's responsibility to keep the man faithful, because if they're not giving him what he needs by his design, then of course he's going to go. It's in his nature, right? If your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have. So there's this assumption in all of this writing, too, that women don't have sexual needs or desires.
Right.
That it's just the man. And that they must submit and surrender and give him these things, whether they enjoy it or not, because it's all about keeping him from having an affair, apparently. But for a husband, sex is pure need. Not a want, it's a need. Ooh. His eyes, ears, brains, and emotions get clouded if he doesn't have that release. I wish I was done. Then a quote from For Women Only, same author, tells women to accept the struggle he has with lust. If your husband feels you do not respect his struggle and his maleness, he'll pull back. So if he's not, engaged in your marriage, in your relationship, it's your fault because you're not giving him what he needs sexually. By the way, kind of interesting that these books were all written by men. Obviously men who had psychological problems. And there's another book called Intended for Pleasure that says the only activity that is to break regular sexual relations is prayer and fasting for some specific cause. Now, they are quoting scripture there.
Misquoting
but
scripture.
They're very much misquoting it. And then The Act of Marriage, which is another Tim LaHaye book, describes a husband who raped his wife while she was kicking and screaming on their wedding night as unequally happy as his rape victim because she had never embraced sex in their marriage. So the only reason that it was rape was because she wasn't embracing the sex in their marriage.
Oh my word!
That is not a good take.
A book called His Needs, and you wonder why I don't like Tim LaHaye. And a book says His Needs, Her Needs says he is pawing and grabbing because he needs something very badly. Many men tell me they wish their sex drive wasn't so strong. As one 32-year-old executive put it, I feel like a fool, like I'm begging her or even raping her. And these are like, we're talked about as if this was just normal. This is just how God designed men. Now, these all came from Sheila Gregor. I think I'm saying her name right, but she's got a Twitter thread, and I was just reading quotes from books that and I verified that these were the actual quotes from the books, and I had actually read the Tim LaHaye one and the Every Man's Battle one before. And I do remember reading it as like a young man, the Every Young Man's Battle, and being like, oh, so it validated me and made me feel, like it's normal for me to struggle with sexual sin. But then it also made me feel like there was no reason to really try and fight it because that's just how I was designed, right? So I
didn't
just needed to practice self-control until I got married, and then my wife would give it to me because that was her job.
Right, and that was another take in another book. Is like, well, if you're struggling, say, with pornography or excessive masturbation or something like that. By the way, again, not safe for work podcast for today. But if you're struggling with those things, the best, one of the best solutions is getting married. And it's like, well, no, because you may not be gratified in your marriage. And I think the common thread here, although I didn't realize how bad it was from those threads, but what I was going to iterate is, the idea is that sexual gratification is a need of a man, right? We do not need to have sex. Okay, men do not need to have sex. We can go our whole lives without having sex and be fine. But that's not what we have been taught in popular evangelical culture.
Yes,
not to give Ravi Zacharias
evangelical culture.
Evangelical
Evangelical
culture.
Christian authors. Every single one of those quotes, Christian authors, I just read. These were things that were being taught. These were Bible studies that were being had in churches.
And there's not really any scriptural basis for this either, right? I mean, not for the
No, to me it sounds like it was just written by a bunch of really horny guys.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's very concerning.
And it's very self-serving, right?
Yeah.
Too. So I don't want to give guys an out through this, but the reality is you're saturated in this all the time, right? Somebody like, Ravi Zacharias, in a moment may say, well, I need this, or I deserve this. I'm not getting it here. When really you could have just said, well, you know what? Maybe you're not getting it at home, but that may mean you're not going to get it at all because you made a covenant, and that's
right.
Okay. Get over it, right? Like I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be, but I'm just saying, like we have to get away from. We can. I mean, if we believe in the Holy Spirit, for heaven's sake, I mean, we can show self-control in our life. Okay, we don't need. Some of that stuff's beyond me. After giving birth, you expect your wife to do things like that? You should be serving your wife. I'm sorry.
No. This was a pre-marriage counseling book that was telling the woman to give her husband blowjobs and handjobs if she was having postpartum depression, because otherwise he'll fall into sin, and he'll fall into sexual sin.
So
completely taking the responsibility off of the man. I mean, it's appalling.
Right. Wow.
And this was used in pre-marriage counseling in churches all across America.
Well, I've been on a journey, right? I mean, for a while I bought into that, and certainly the testosterone and things like that. Maybe you could make the argument that men have a higher sex drive most of the time. Okay, that's a very important distinction to make, because there are women who are wired with a higher sex drive. That's a thing that happens. Okay. There's just so many stereotypes here within popular, again, what Caitlin Beatty so well termed as the sexual prosperity gospel. And I think that it's by buying into this idea that if I do X, Y, and Z, then I won't have to worry about temptation. Well, what about when your wife does give birth, or she goes through menopause, or all these kind of things, right? Not factoring that in. The list goes on, and all of a sudden, somebody like Ravi Zacharias or Carl Lentz feels vindicated in what they're doing because a Christian leader told me that I need this, and my wife's to blame.
Well, and I think a lot of people make a big emphasis on, like, well, it's not a sin to be tempted. It's just a sin if you act on it, right? But I would argue that if your wife is experiencing postpartum depression because she just pushed a human being out of her body, and the only thing you can think about is the fact that you're not getting any, you need to get over yourself. Like, there's a heart problem that needs to be
or go to
dealt with.
therapy. Maybe there's a thing going on where, like, maybe you consume so much porn that your sex drive is higher than it should be, or something like that. But yeah, if that's overriding,
my point is,
right,
regardless of what the next steps are, that reveals a heart issue.
It reveals a heart issue. Yes, absolutely.
We ought to be dying to ourselves. I mean, that's what a good marriage is built on. Not the wife just giving us sex whenever we want.
You
It's
woke
built-
womanly man.
It's built on dying to yourself and serving to each other.
I 100% agree. I mean, listen, okay, so sex is part of like motivation for getting married, but at the end of the day, it's not the core of a marriage covenant. And if you make a marriage covenant and never get to have sex, then that should be okay with you.
That should be an extremely small part of the motivation, if at all.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I see that more as a reward of that relationship rather than like something that you get to enjoy, but it's not the purpose. You know what I mean?
When Joshua Harris walked away from his faith in kind of a...
When he kissed Christianity
When he
goodbye.
kissed Christianity goodbye. That's when Caitlin Beatty in 2019 wrote an article called, and it is in Christian Headlines. I think it ended up being published in Christianity Today as well. But she wrote an article called Joshua Harris and the Sexual Prosperity Gospel. She describes that transactional thing of like, well, if you stay pure, wear your purity ring, don't have sex until your wedding night, then you're going to have a great sex life. You're not going to deal with temptation. Or if you do, it's okay. We'll fix your wife so that she fulfills your needs or whatever. You know what I mean? So there's all this thing kind of swirling around. And she talks about a case of right after they got married, of a Christian couple that right after they got married found that sex was going to be painful for the wife and that they probably would not have a normal sex life their entire marriage.
Right.
And they were like, what do we do now? Like the whole premise has been around the fact that like I'm supposed to fulfill his needs and we're supposed to have sex because that's going to vindicate all this time we wait. What did we wait for? If so the question then becomes, why are you being pure? Is it because the Christian sexual ethic is compelling to you and the Holy Spirit guides you in that, or because you've been told that it's the way it is biologically, or I don't know. I think it's just it's all muddled.
You're waiting for your reward at the end of the
Right.
rainbow. Once you have that wedding day, then all those problems disappear.
Even Albert Mohler, which I have a complicated relationship with, said, nowhere do the scriptures tell mankind that if we just do our part, not Siri, nowhere do the scriptures tell mankind that if we just do our part, God will do his, right? So obedience is not a guarantee of a good life. The Bible shows that over and over again.
Yeah.
So I don't even know where to begin. I think for me, when people start tying this to Ravi Zacharias, I want to do more research. Is like, probably, yeah. I mean, like this culture, certainly created I don't know what I'm trying to say, a platform for this to occur. It made it easier for this to occur, perhaps. But I wonder if he, drank the same Kool-Aid.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing, is there's no guarantee that this culture is what led to these sort of actions, but it certainly leaves room for it.
Yeah.
And I just, we have to use our critical thinking skills, because for me, growing up in the church, right, in this culture, it's like, well, if somebody hands me a book, well, there's Bible verses in it. This is great, and I just kind of bought all of it as it was given to me. And for new believers or young believers, like, we have to do better as far as the resources that we're giving them, and as far as just like training up people in the church to, as they're reading books and as they're hearing things, to use their critical thinking skills, to test these things by the scripture. Because just reading some of those quotes from books that were used in our churches that were written by leaders in evangelical culture, that should reveal that evangelical culture is not infallible. There are a lot of deep-seated problems in the American church.
Yeah.
And yes, I do think that some of the moral failings of leaders are a symptom of that.
Yeah. I think Joshua Harris's departure isn't surprising when you frame it under the sexual prosperity gospel. And some of these failings aren't surprising if you're telling men that if your wife isn't satisfying you, poor you. Like they're the victim all of a sudden, right? Ravi Zacharias may have felt like a victim, and then in doing so created victims. Here's the quote from the couple that was went to a psychologist in Wheaton that was a Christian, and she said that not being able to consummate our marriage was a source of pain and grief and anger towards God. I had to process the assumption that that by saving myself for marriage, that I would receive from God the blessing of a good sex life with my husband, and I didn't receive that. And then Beatty writes on her own, when prosperity teachings failed to pan out, it not only puts the teaching in question, it also calls into question the very goodness and faithfulness of God. And if you read like Harris's work, he ties faith and his own framework so closely together that I am sure when he found out that he was a misogynist, yeah, I mean that's, and he will say that too, and that he found out I created this misogynist cesspool of teaching, and then all of a sudden he was like, well, that's not, I don't want to be part of faith if that's, so he tied that to his understanding of God, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's interesting because a lot of people hear us, maybe challenging some of these teachings and resources, and are like, well, you're just, you're a liberal, or you're this, or you're, whatever. Like, no, we are so committed to true biblical purity that we won't settle for something like this. This is cheap. It's inauthentic.
It's Walmart brand.
And the Bible calls us to so much better. It calls us to holiness. And this isn't that.
This whole thing, purity culture, it was motivated by a commitment or a conference or a set of ideas that are not biblical at all. And I think it reveals a bigger problem in the American church today. And that is that we are not tying our sanctification to a genuine relationship with God, right? Jesus said, and it's hard to teach this, I know, but it's the truth. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey me, right? We follow a Christian sexual ethic, and I do teach kids, to wait until marriage. I waited till marriage. I'm so glad that I did. I don't think that it's going to give me a lifetime of sexual bliss, okay? I don't think that. And I don't think I'm owed that or that I deserve that. I did it because I love Jesus. I walked away from situations that I think may have been inappropriate before I got married because I was thinking of Jesus, right? I was thinking of the sexual Christian ethic that is laid out by Paul the Apostle. I was thinking about my relationship to Christ, not this is the right thing to do, or it is, but because of who Jesus is, not because of any sort of hormones that I have, or, I'm going to be fulfilled or vindicated, or my word. No, it's crazy. But it also reveals, we could go on and on. This reveals a whole problem too with, it's been politicized, but there was that whole thing about toxic masculinity and things like that. And we have misdefined gender roles. I don't think that everything kind of blends together, but
yeah, I actually have some things that I want to share on the after show.
Okay.
Ooh.
So, specifically, I actually want to dig much deeper into the Billy Graham rule. So, yeah, it'll be an interesting discussion. So, Patreons, I hope you're ready. Here's the deal. I really recommend, we've talked about this book several times, but Holy Sexuality by Christopher Yuan. Or Ewan? Is it Ewan?
I think it's Yuan.
I don't know.
It's Christopher Yaun.
My buddy Chris wrote a book, and it's called Holy Sexuality. My buddy Doctor. It's really good, but I think to just kind of to summarize, like our identity should not be rooted in sexuality, right? Yeah. And it's we go so hard after the LGBTQ plus community, all these things for them doing that, but as Christians, we've done that as well. We really have. For young people who are struggling, we've dealt with it by attaching identities to these things, and sex was never meant to be that. So live a life of holiness because that's what God wants. not because you're expecting anything in return. I guess that's really the main takeaway from today, if we were to summarize it. So thank you, as always, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing our Patreons on the after show. Ryan?
Ja, yeet.